Welcome to the part 1 of the GBADs Dash tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to be covering how to use major components of Plotly Dash. I'm going to be going in depth on all of their attributes and how to use callbacks. If you haven't already, please check out the tutorial PDF. It'll help you get this Jupyter notebook running alongside your Python 3 environment, and it'll help you get all the installation done for that. So by the end of these tutorials, you will know how to create a dashboard using Plotly Dash. By the end of this tutorial, I hope you learn how to use Plotly Dash, and you'll know about all of the major components and callbacks. Prerequisites for this is that you have some knowledge of programming in Python 3, and hopefully you have your Python 3 environment set up so you can follow along inside Jupyter Notebooks. And then you have a knowledge of HTML that would make using these components a little bit easier, because Dash uses some common HTML components as well. And then for the following tutorials, maybe CSS, because it'll be used for styling the components. I also included some resources that you can check out. These are also available in the PDF. There's a couple for just programming in Python, HTML, and CSS here, and then the official Plotly documentation. And then of course there's some stuff about design. So just a tool to kind of visualize your design before you start programming, and just some more tips about dashboard design and some examples. So moving on to Dash installation, now that you'll have Python and installed, you'll also have pip installed, which is the installation tool for Python. If you're developing a dashboard using Dash on your machine, you'll have to install the Dash libraries. And then, of course, you can install other libraries such as like pandas to help you with data manipulation, which is something that we're going to do in this tutorial. And then if you're working in a Jupyter notebook like we are right now, you also need to install this library as well, so that you can run the Dash components in a Jupyter notebook. So moving on to the imports for this notebook. First of all, we have Dash, and then we have Jupyter Dash, which is required for the Jupyter notebook. If not, this line is not important if you're just developing it locally. Then we have Dash dependencies for all the callbacks. So we have input, output, and state, which we'll be using later. And then for the components, we have DCC, so Dash core components, and HTML components. Then we also have pandas, NumPy, JSON to handle just all the data. And then Dash table, which is another type of component that I'll be showing later on. So let's get the Dash app started first. So what I like to usually do is set up any external style sheets, because this is used inside when you're setting up your app. So this is a common style sheet that is used in most apps when you're just beginning. Later on, when you get more used to like styling, you can add your own CSS style sheets here. So we need to make a variable called app. Since we're in a Jupyter notebook, this is how it would look like, or else it would look like this, just dash dot dash. And then the rest, all the attributes are pretty much the exact same. And this just sets up the app. Next, we're gonna do reading in some data to use in the components below. Here we just have reading in from a JSON file, and then reading in from a CSV file. Moving on to components. So there's two main components to dashboard and Plotly Dash: the layout and callbacks. The layout is the first part, which defines what the application or your dashboard is going to look like. And in the layout, it's going to have all the components, and all the styling is done here. The layout is composed kind of like a tree of components, kind of like HTML. And Dash also actually includes pure HTML components as well. The rest are actually generated from the Dash library that we imported above. And you can have multiple layouts, but for a multi-page dash, but for this tutorial, we're just going to have one layout. So the next main components are callbacks. Callbacks are functions that give the Plotly components more functionality. So essentially, they allow you to change any of the attributes given an input, output, and a state. And the great thing about this is that it's all handled automatically by Dash, which is good for user interaction and loading performance. Usually all of the data manipulation is also handled within callbacks. Okay, so moving on to the first layout component, that would be a drop-down. So drop-downs allow you to group options together. You can also make a drop-down to select multiple options as well. This is kind of what an app layout looks for Plotly. You start with your main HTML div, which is pure HTML. Inside that, you can have some headings, and then just more divs to just separate and sort your components. And then whenever you're using a dash core component, you use DCC instead of HTML, as you can see here. So I'll go over a dropdown. Every component, just like in HTML, can have an ID. And then what's special to dropdowns is the options. So you have a list of options here, and here each option will have the label and the value. Currently we're just using the exact same thing. So this label, the label is what will show up in the dropdown, and the value is what will be inputted when it's selected. So here we have chickens as the label, and then chickens also as the value, both strings. And then we have 3 options, and then we set the value to chickens to use the first option. So as we can see here, it's already set to chickens because the first value is chickens. And then you can see style, which I'll go into in the next tutorial. But this is just used to style the component. Currently it's just making the color of the font black. So this is for a single select dropdown. So you can select one option at a time. Next we have a multi-select dropdown here, which is similar to the previous single select dropdown, except the only difference here is that in your value you'll have a list of options, and here we can also have a placeholder value just in case there's no option selected. So as you can see that there's 2 options selected, and then since we have this multi equals true attribute, this allows you to select multiple options. When there's no option selected, it'll go straight to the placeholder, which says select species here. But here we can select multiple options, and the attributes are essentially very similar to the simple dropdown. Moving on to inputs, the next type of dash component that we'll be looking at. Here we've got 4 different types of inputs, and what I'll do is I'll go over each type. So first we have just the text type. So essentially each of these inputs is the exact same component. All we're doing is changing the type attribute, and this one is a simple text input. So the type is text, and you can enter some short text here. Next we have a number input, which only will take in numbers, and we'll also have an up counter and a down for easy selection. And that's changed by just changing the type attribute. Next we have an email type, which will correct the type of input that's being entered. So if it's not a valid email address, it'll kind of show a warning. And then after that we have just a simple search input, which is very similar to the first one. You would be able to use those interchangeably. As you can see, the input is incorrect. It's just random letters, so there's a red warning label, but as soon as you type in an actual email, it'll show as a valid email and no warning. And here this is just a search, which will you can empty your search and then or search. Moving on to the next text area. It's very similar to the input above, except this is used for storing larger amounts of text, multiple lines of text as well. The components very similar here as well. You have an ID, a value, placeholder. These are like the three main things, and then you also have styling, which for this one is a bit more useful because it's like a text box. So setting the height and width can be important for styling. So the first one is just a simple text area where users can enter. These are resizable as well. You can make it not resizable if wanted using more attributes. And then this one is just the exact same thing, except it has a working callback. So what we have here is a callback. Now this callback has an output, input, and a state. The output is actually this div right here, where we're using the same ID right here. And then the input is actually the button seen right here. And then the state is actually what is in this text area. So whatever is entered here when this button is clicked will show up down here. So we can give that a little test. So you can see that when I clicked on this input, it looked at the state of this text area and outputted test. That's pretty much how a simple callback would work. Essentially what you're doing here is you use the ID of any component you want, and then the next thing you'll use the attribute that you want to change or look at. So for the output, I want to change what's in children here, and that's the text that's being saved in this text area. For the button, I'm looking at the attribute n clicks, which is just the number of clicks. So it's looking at whenever this button is clicked, it'll activate this callback. And then for the state, I'm looking at the value of what is inside this text area. So that's essentially how callbacks work. Next up, we have reading from a file. And what I'm doing here is just using a text area to display a file. And since this shows how text areas are useful to display large file contents, as I said before, this can be resizable, so you can make it as big as you want, and you can just scroll through the text. The attribute here, read only true, makes it so that I can't actually change the value inside this text area, so I can't edit any of these. That's a good way of just making a text area display only. Next up, we have sliders. Sliders can be useful to select a value between a range. There's also range sliders, which can be useful to select a range of values. Both types of sliders can include steps and marks, make the slider easy to follow. So first thing here, we have just a simple slider between two ranges. Sliders have a min and max attribute, which defines where the values will start and where the values will end, so the range. And then the value, so where the slider like point is going to start, and then the step, the value that it will increment through this range, so by 1 year. Here's the example of the first one, so it goes through 1 by 1. And this one also has another callback here, which I'll explain right now. So essentially this one's simpler than the callback above because there's no state involved. It just has the output and the input. So it has the output of this text right here, and then it has the input of this slider. So you can see where the slider is currently because it doesn't have any labels, right? Next, we have a slider that has preset steps included in it. So, and you can do that just by adding more attributes called marks. So these points are preset, and since there's no step, it will automatically go to one of these values when you're sliding through the slider. Following that, we have a range slider. So this slider is in between it has two different points, and you can slide each of them. Similar callback here, except this time the output is actually a list of two values, because that's what these range sliders values are. It's actually a list of two values. Similar to the simple slider with marks, you can also have marks in a range slider as well. And then if you set step to none, it will only get set at those preset points. Next up, we have data tables, which can be used to show information from a file in like a table format, especially a CSV file, which is what is happening here. I'm displaying some data from a CSV file in a table. So this is the dash table component, and this is why we had to import a different library here. We're actually using the dash table, not DCC anymore, for this component. But it's similar to other components where it has an ID and then just other attributes. It has separate styling for each of the table parts. So the cells and headers have separate styling. And one of the main attributes here is data, which is pretty much just taking in the data that we read in above. And then the columns, which sets up the headers. The data is the rest of the table, and the columns are just the headers. Next up, we have a bit more complicated components, tabs and graphs. Here, we're just going to be showing simple bar graphs and in separate tabs. So first, let's go over the tabs, and then we'll look at the graphs. So this first component is a tab that uses a callback to generate its values. So essentially, you have a DCC tabs component, and then inside of this, you have a tab for each tab you want. And then in this tab component, the value is set to an attribute where it is generated based on a callback, and that callback essentially just generates a graph, which I'll show below. So this is the callback that it's calling render content, and it renders a tab. What it's doing is taking in the value of what tab it's on, so like 1, 2, or 3. Based on that, it's returning just a graph that is being generated right here. So as you can see, when I click tab 1, graph 1 is generated. When I click tab 2, graph 2 is generated. So that's how callbacks can get a bit more complicated, because you can generate what type of output you want, and since children can be an output, you can actually add more like layout components in your callback. Right here, so we'll just go over a graph as well. The graph component has a figure attribute, which takes in any data in a dictionary format, and then that also takes in which type of graph you want. So here we're just using a simple bar graph, as you can see. You can set this to different types of graphs as well. The next one is a simpler example. It just shows the tabs, so DCC tabs component, and then there's multiple tabs, as you can see here. Inside each tab, we have a graph, so they're already in the layout. They're static essentially, unlike the other example. Here we have 3 separate graphs in 3 separate tabs, right here. tab 1, tab 2, and tab 3. And they're just double bar graphs. So that essentially covers most of the components, most of the major components in Plotly Dash that we'll be using. There are other components as well, which I'd encourage you to take a look at, such as radio buttons. They can be useful. And then just learning how to use callbacks to change attributes of anything. Essentially, you can use callbacks to change the attributes of even simple HTML components to change the style, which I'll be covering in the next tutorial. This is just everything put together, all in one example, all the components. In the next tutorial, I'll be going over dashboard design and the PPS dashboard. It'll show you how to customize your components and add them to tabs for the PPS dashboard.